Okay. Hello, folks. If you're watching this, what I've had to do is I've had to re-record this. Things got messed up, and I apologize if it hasn't been there the last several days. But I felt like I needed to because things were technically not really correct, and the days weren't correct either. So what this is this is a recording of the classes that met October 2nd through October 7th. It's actually a combination of 2 gold days and 2 blue days. And the reason for that is because students began coming in person in classes, and the class schedules um, didn't they didn't all meet on the same days exactly like we're used to. So anyhow, what I'm doing is I'm going to record because of the overlap and a little bit of the confusion in the last videos. What I'm doing is I'm combining in this one lesson actually 2 days, so 2 PowerPoints. So it will be a little bit longer. You can pause whenever you would like, of course. So uh, I won't continue to talk about certain things when I know that you can pause and get it on your own. Just remember that, as always, in these PowerPoints, in the Let's Talk, whether you're getting it through the video or you're clicking on it in Schoology, remember that you're going through and you're paying close attention to the items that have blue arrows beside them. Those are the items that are going to be on the test. That's the way it's going to continue to be throughout the school year. So that's an easy way to know what you need to study for the test. Just a reminder for folks. All right, so let's begin here. This chapter, which is chapter 20 in the online textbook, is about immigration and the cities that they moved into and the problems they had. So the first section we're going to talk about is called A New Wave of Immigration. So let's begin that. You'll notice from this picture, these are people that are getting off a boat. This happens to be Ellis Island. And it may look like, man, they're really carrying a lot of stuff there. But really, this is what they've chosen to bring with them to their new country, their new life. And so, really, it's not that much when you think this is all they now possess. So, why might these people be taking such a risk to come to the United States? That's the first question. And it's because they're being persecuted for either political or religious reasons in those old countries, or, and this is probably even more likely, it's because they're poor and they either can't find the jobs that they need, or maybe they have those jobs and they don't make enough to make ends meet. So they're literally pursuing an American dream. And the second question, what are some contributions that are made to American culture by these immigrants? I'm not going to highlight that too much, but I will just say that because 40% of our nation came from immigrants in this time period, you can just imagine that immigrants in all aspects of American life, these immigrants made great contributions to business, to American culture, the arts, across the board. All right. And imagine this, and I'll go ahead and just read this. You live with your family on a small farm in Italy in the 1890s. You want to earn some money to help your parents, but there are not many jobs nearby. You have heard that jobs are easy to find in the booming factories of America. Now, this next says write a list. In class, we just asked students to write one thing that would be good about traveling to America to look for work, and one thing that might not be so good. So you can always pause and do that on your own, if you will, please. And I will not tell you to always pause. You can just do that on your own. Down at the bottom is a recording of 2 immigrants that came to America in 1925. It's a little bit later time period, but it's interesting to listen. So let's have it here.
Yes, it was very disrupting, to pack and to break up your home. Of course, all our clothing and some pieces of like china that were very, very special, and maybe a blanket or two also that were real good wool, that we felt maybe we may not be able to get here in the United
pressure to leave things there, but they accommodated us kids, and I brought a lot of things that I now wonder why I was so attached. But I was attached, for instance, to greeting cards. They were very, very romantic in those days, and they were through the years, birthdays, and so on. And a few toys, my tin soldiers, for instance, so on. I don't remember whether I brought anything about my small railroad. Oh, yes, yes. And then I had what we call magic lantern. It was a projector, very primitive compared to today's.
And I was hoping he wouldn't bring those soldiers, because when we played together at home, you see, I was German and he was French, and he would always decimate, all my soldiers, killed them all off. And so we had quite a different right.
Okay, I think it's always interesting to hear those voices. You can hear those accents, maybe not be able to place the country they're from, but it's interesting because these are real folks talking about real experiences. Again, a reminder, the blue arrows, these are the items that'll be on the test. If you go through any Let's Talk and write down, study, review anything with a blue arrow, you're going to do well on the test. So the old immigrants, these are the folks that have been around for quite some time now. And actually, in charts, it's showing old immigrants coming from just after the founding of our country. And we know there were immigrants before, of course, but we're calling the old immigrants the ones from 1800 to 1860, a 60-year time period. And they are coming from the places we're most familiar when we read the early days of America, where they're coming from. They're coming from Great Britain, Ireland, and Germany. And during that 60-year time period, 5 million immigrants came into our country. That's a good number when you consider that the population wasn't, of course, back then what it was going to later become. But 5 million in a 60-year period. Now, these new immigrants, the reason they came up with these names is because the people who were here, they're seeing these people come in, and they're coming from different places. And so literally they're like, well, the ones that have been here, we're going to call them the old immigrants. And now these new ones coming in, we're going to call them the new immigrants. And they're coming in the late 1800s. And in the 1880s, 5 million came in. And that's in a 10-year period. It was the same amount of immigrants that had come in 60 years previously. So this is a really large influx of people coming in, and they came in from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were folks like the Slovaks and the Russians, the Czechs, the Greeks, the Italians, in large part, Hungarians, also Jewish folks. They're coming in as new immigrants. Remember, you need to write this down for your notes and study. I'm going to let you pause as you see fit. Again, in class, of course, I'm spending much more time allowing everybody to write. I won't do that during the presentations today. So this long journey, wherever it began, they paid basically $30. That's pretty common that was the amount that they paid to be in steerage, which is below deck. It's a very hot, dirty, crowded place. And there would, of course, be passengers that had money, and those tickets could range from anywhere from $40 to $90. This is the first class passengers, people who could afford something a little nicer. And as I mentioned to the folks in class, if you've seen the movie Titanic, you get a pretty good idea of the difference between the ones that are well-to-do and the ones that are down below, if you had a chance to see that movie. Let's listen to Mr. Morris Schneider talk about coming over.
When we got on the Rotterdam, we had a field day one. I was never on a ship before. I was awed by it. It was overwhelming. All the people and boarding the ship was all a brand new experience. We left Rotterdam. We set sail, and about a half hour after the ship started, my sister got very seasick. It took us 14 days to cross the Atlantic, and in the entire crossing, she was in steerage, and the only time she came out for a breath of fresh air is just about a half hour before we saw the Statue of Liberty. Now, the experience on the ship, being young, was an advantage in that particular situation because we were on the lowest level of the ship. We couldn't go aboard. Some kids were more adventurous, my brother and I, and we would sneak aboard. We were always chased, and we saw some people who traveled maybe in first or second class, and we looked upon them as royalty, but we were confined primarily to steerage. Steerage was one huge place. It was the lowest deck. The stench, it was the summer in August, the humidity, the heat, having no air conditioning, having no cooling facilities. It was very hot, compounded by the fact that there must have been anywhere from 200 to 300 people in that huge cavernous area. The body smells, the body odors, the lack of sanitation, lack of any kind of facilities, washing. There was no such thing as washing or bathing. The stench, the vermin, it was rat infested. But being children, I guess, had its advantages in this case because we always tried to get out of there. We tried to get out of the steerage, get out of the babble of voices, get out of the heat and the stench, and get on the main deck. We were permitted to stay there for a little while, but we were constantly chased. But the crossing went for us, for me in particular, went very quickly.
Okay, very interesting, I think. One more reminder about how the blue arrows work. You're to copy you're to copy all of a paragraph that it points to, and any words in yellow like steerage or any names that are in yellow, those will be on the test for sure. Those, so pay particular attention to words like steerage. We're going to skip this one. We skipped it in class as well. It's about a video about a man remembering crossing in a storm, and it's a little bit more difficult to understand. It's not quite as gripping as the other accounts. So then they arrive, and when they arrive to the United States, they don't just pull up in a city's dock and everybody gets off the boat. You can't do that. So they go to immigrant processing centers. The most famous one is Ellis Island, just in New York Harbor. And in those immigration centers, they are interviewed, they are checked for diseases, legal problems, and it's a process they have to go through. And I'm sure they were quite nervous, wondering were they going to be successful and get to enter the main part of the United States. And so here's a little account from Miss Gertrude Gudrun Moller and her changing her name.
I was born Gudrun Hildebrandt and married Muller, Mr. Muller, who was from Denmark. He immigrated here many years later, and we met in New York. However, when I started school in Chicago, where I grew up, needless to say, first of all, I couldn't speak a word of English, and I was the only child in the school that couldn't speak English. And it wasn't too happy the first couple of years, but my mama said, take heart, because someday you're going to be able to speak two languages, and all the ones that were teasing you will speak only one. And it was true. She was always right. And so the teacher suggested, since none of the children could pronounce Gudrun, which is an old Germanic Scandinavian name, and a very beautiful name, I hear, she gave me a list of girls' names to choose from, so that all the kids could converse, call, what to call me. So I picked the name starting with a G, as with my name, and it was Gertrude. I'm not very happy with it, but it has stuck with me all of these years.
Okay, so we heard from Dr. Mueller, because she was an immigrant, it means nothing in terms of intelligence and ability to be successful. So she did end up getting her doctorate, her PhD. Yay, good deal. Okay, there's a picture of Ellis Island. I mentioned it. It is the busiest uh, processing center on the East Coast, Ellis Island. And when you write that down, look at the second blue arrow. Only 2% were denied access into our country. And we've really been stressing that in class. 98% were successful. So it was a risk worth taking for most people. And I would guess that the 2% that were turned away, it was probably because of some kind of medical, the diseases, things of that nature would be my guess. If you need more time, you can always pause. Mexican immigrants. So the East Coast, with Ellis Island, wasn't the only place that they entered the country. Mexican immigrants, it wouldn't make sense for them to board a ship to come into a processing center when all they had to do was cross over from Mexico into Texas. So that's what they did. They came in through El Paso and then found jobs in the Southwest, places like steel mills or construction or mines. The last uh, immigration center that we're going to talk about is another famous one. Again, it has the word island at the end of it, Angel Island. It's on the West Coast because if you're coming from Asia, it makes no sense to come all the way around the earth to get to New York's Ellis Island when if you just go straight across the Pacific Ocean, you hit California. So they came through a little processing center right there near San Francisco called Angel Island. Now, it was a bit different here. They were not nearly as successful getting in, the Chinese weren't, as the Europeans were. And I just have to say that that's a lot of it probably had to do with racist tendencies, but they were stricter. And whereas people in Ellis Island had to maybe wait a couple of days to find out, sometimes the wait was a week to 2 weeks, or possibly months in Angel Island for the Chinese people, and not nearly as many were successful getting in after that wait. A picture of the processing center on Angel Island, and I do not know what's on the monument there to the right. It's interesting though. So, how were the experiences different at the two? I just quickly let you in on that when I was talking about the racist tendencies and the big long lag time. So the immigrants at Ellis Island were much more successful. It was much quicker and much more positive experience by far. So once they get off the boat, let's just say we're there in New York. Let's use that as an example. They're now successfully through the processing center of Ellis Island. That means they now board the ferry and it's a very short ferry ride. They can see the city right there from Ellis Island. And they move over. Now what did they do? Well, most of them, and let's just say you're Italian and you don't speak English. Where in the world are you going to go? Well, they sought out neighborhoods where there were already Italian people. And that makes sense because they could speak with those people, and those people could help them out and help be translators and help them get settled. So most immigrants, they did move into the neighborhoods where there were others from that same country. It just made sense for them, and it also helped them preserve their customs and traditions. So if you're in a Chinese area of town, um, there's places where you can buy the ingredients for making Chinese food. If you're in an Italian part of town, the grocery stores have pasta and the things that you need. So that's what we're talking about with customs and traditions and churches and things of that nature. What is very important, particularly for later discussions, is what you see down at the bottom: tenement. A tenement is a really, it's just basically a poorly built apartment building, and they are piling in the immigrants into these tenement houses. Uh, So they are sometimes 5, 7, maybe even a few more people into a room that's only about 300 square feet. Whole families living in very small, crowded areas. Remember, they don't have a whole lot of money. That doesn't mean they're not going to one day, but right now, getting off the boat in the first few years are here, probably pretty tough. I'm going to go ahead and skip this. You can again pause. That we just had a class discussion at this point. Oh, I did want to say, how could they get help financially on question number 2? Business owners would let them come on in because most of these people were hardworking people, and then let them have groceries or whatever, and they'd take note of whatever was taken, and with the understanding that they were, once they got jobs and all, they would come back and pay them back. And others gave them small loans. It's interesting to note Bank of America, which is one of America's greatest, biggest banks. It started out as a Bank of Italy by an immigrant in San Francisco. Benevolent societies. These are groups of kind-hearted people who want to help the immigrants, and probably a lot of them are immigrants themselves who have now become successful and want to help other people like them be successful like they have become. And so what are they doing? They're helping these immigrants when it comes to their attention that there's real sickness or death, or they just can't even find jobs. And for those family members, they would offer help. So this isn't like a location where people went to get help. These are people that would come to the immigrants and help them out. Benevolent societies. You can definitely expect this on the test. It's in yellow with a blue arrow. Why, and ask the question, why do they matter? The main thing I highlighted on this slide is you got to remember this is the United States in the 1880s, 90s, 1900. There was no such thing as food stamps, welfare, social security, so many things we have to help people in need in today, in the current day. They didn't have that back then. They had that. That's not going to come until after the Depression. So these benevolent societies are giving people a chance to get together and socialize. Now, this, I said there weren't buildings, but I guess I was wrong. I'd forgotten that there were a few of them that did have, like this Irish society, did have a location where people could come and learn about their new country. So people paid to join, and money was used to help these new members. All right, I ask folks to take a look at this, the people in this picture. We need to know the term sweatshops. Most industries and businesses back then that were very large, the big businesses we've talked about, they're not usually very nice, great, wonderful places to work. Usually pretty unhealthy working conditions, long hours. We've discussed all of that. The ones that were known to be making clothes, they got the nickname sweatshops. And that's an easy name to probably remember because these are workshops where you are sweating all day long. So sweatshops is a common name for these places. But now that doesn't mean that every immigrant's poor and working in a low wage job that's unskilled, because some of them had high skills. And here's some examples down at the bottom. People like bakers, carpenters, masons. Masons are people that work with bricks. Skilled machinists. So some of them even opened their own businesses. This sign's interesting. Help wanted. No Irish. Need apply. I think this is interesting because in this country we most often think of racism and prejudice having to do with one race against another, but not in this instance. The Irish are white, and the people that are against them are white. What's going on there in this particular example is The Irish are Catholic, and most of the Americans, not all, but most of them are Protestant. So the Irish are looked upon as not being wanted here many times. So to the text here, it says that many people did welcome the new immigrants because they were willing to work for low wages, right? So they needed employees. But anti-immigrant attitudes continued to grow throughout the 1800s. And the question there is, why would some Americans feel this way? And here's your answer. It's ironic, the term nativism. And the reason I say ironic, to remind you what irony means, it means it's not what you would expect. It's not what you would expect when you talk about nativism. These people call themselves nativists, which is really close to the word native. Well, they're not Native Americans. They're not American Indians, but they've been here a while and they think it's their land. And so they are fearful that these new immigrants, this is the answer to the previous question. Why would they be anti-immigrant? It's because they're fearful that these new people coming in are going to change the country or take jobs away from them. Sound familiar to current times? Sometimes it sounds very familiar. So they viewed them as a threat, and sometimes they were violent toward these immigrants, and sometimes they wanted laws to stop or limit immigration. So I ask you this question: do you think that they were successful in stopping immigrants from coming in? Were they successful in stopping immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe from entering the U.S.? Nope. Nope. Niet, nein. I've just put no in a lot of languages there. And thank goodness. Otherwise, many of us wouldn't be Americans. And I can tell from the last names of a number of students in my classes that they did come. Some of their ancestors, at least the way the name carried down, did come from Eastern and Southern Europe. It's very apparent. So we wouldn't have people in our classes in many cases. But here's the deal. I said they didn't stop the Europeans. Were they able to get the Chinese banned? Yes. And I'm assuming it's probably because the Chinese were so different looking and acting from what they were accustomed to. The new Europeans may not have looked that different from the old immigrants. But Chinese people look different, have a different religion, different, very vastly different language in writing and in speaking. They have just very different customs. And I think there was a bit of fear and prejudice going on there. So the Chinese Exclusion Act, they got that passed, and it banned Chinese people from entering the United States for 10 years. First time that a group of people have been able, first time that that anybody's been able to be banned from the entering the country. So what were some of the challenges faced by immigrants to the U.S. in the 1800s? I'll leave that to you to consider. I would think finding new jobs, getting over being homesick, one thing. They've lived in these other countries, not speaking the same language. So there's social reasons, business reasons. It's going to be really tough. And you put yourself in their place, it'd be very difficult. Okay, so ordinarily in these classes, we had an open discussion where this was talked about much longer than what I just went through. But at this point, we would have been finished. It probably took 45 minutes to an hour to get through that. A lot of questions that were being asked, and I'm sorry I'm not going to be there to discuss it in a deeper level some of the questions you may have or some of the items to you have questions about. So now we have section 2, the growth of cities. Because what's happened is, and we learned this before our last test, the railroads. Remember the railroads coming in and they're linking the cities. And you have the industries are now building up by the railroads in the cities. Remember that? So people are coming in from there, and you've got immigrants coming in from different parts of the world. The cities are really growing much quicker than they were ready for. They had many more people coming in than they had planned. Then you can imagine that causes problems. And as I mentioned to the classes, imagine last year our school had 1,500 people in it. It was the largest middle school in the state of Alabama. It was built to be able to accommodate 1,500 students. But what if suddenly 4,000 students were going to come to Sims? Imagine we don't have a school that's built to be ready for that many students. That's what we're talking about with the growth of cities. They don't have the buildings, the places to live. So let's go ahead and explore that in some depth. Urbanization, that's what we're talking about. The growth of cities is urbanization. Millions of immigrants and native-born Americans flocked to cities in the 1800s. To save time, I'll try to cut down on the pausing, and you can pause as you go. This interesting picture, you see the factories right there, and you can bet that the places to live are right there near the factories where it's easy for workers and to live nearby and get to work. We looked at this chart. This was interesting. We had a very a lengthy, I'd say maybe 5 or 10 minute discussion on this in class. Which city had the highest population in 1900? If you'll look at the chart, you see that on the left side, closest to the city names is a chart of how large these cities were in 1860. 1880 is in the middle, 1900 is just to the right. It's quite obvious that New York City by 1900 has the highest population with almost 3.5 million people. 3,437,000 people. Question number 2 is a little trickier. It says, which city had the highest growth? In other words, what percentage growth from 1860 to 1900? Well, the answer is, I'll spare you trying to figure out on your own here, Chicago. In 1860, it was only 109,000. So, and it grew to almost 1.7 million. So that's almost 17 times larger. So even though New York City went from 1.1 to 3.4, it's incredible to think New York City is 3 times larger, but Chicago is almost 17 times larger. All right, and now you need to copy everything down here. So I kind of already started talking about this a little bit. Why did cities grow? Location of the railroad lines. We remember that from the last chapter. Also, what we haven't discussed yet is, remember we're talking about the second industrial revolution and they're making new machines and things are being invented. Some of those things are for farms. They are machines for farms. And that means you don't need as many people in the countryside that you used to need to raise crops, to harvest crops. You've got machines coming in, so now there's not nearly as many jobs for the people in the country, and so a lot of them are moving into the city. Also, African Americans. Let's just be honest, there's racism in certain parts of the country, and so they're trying to escape racism and trying to also look for better jobs in the city. So they are moving to try to find industrial jobs in the northern cities. And finally, there's the new immigrants that we discussed. And we're going to use Chicago as the example of urban growth because we said it grew almost 17 times larger. So that's the perfect example of a city. So a lot going on there. a lot of problems, but also a lot of solutions. So you'll need to copy everything on this page, but before you do, take a look at, I drew an arrow and said Chicago. It's in the center there of the country, and look at all that looks like red veins right there in the center of it all is Chicago. Each one of those little red lines is a train track, the trains that go throughout the country. And so you can see that Chicago is the center of this. The ones that are coming from the west and leading into Chicago, a lot of them have different types of things having to do with farming. So they've got, once they've harvested corn and wheat, it's being loaded on trains and going into Chicago. And then from there, going to the East Coast where the people are hungry and they need that food. But just as importantly, it's another food source that's going on. There are hogs and cows being raised in the Midwest, and they are being put on trains and going into Chicago. And as you see in the second arrow there, that Chicago becomes a major center for meat packing and slaughterhouses. And that's because the animals are being put on a train going into Chicago, and there they are being slaughtered and turned into meat by butchers, people who really know what they're doing. A lot of these people are new immigrants. They're taking care to package it as meat, and then is now being put on the trains to go to the East Coast where so much of the population is located. So Chicago is the center of so much going on at this time. There's a picture of the streets of Chicago. You will notice that it's mostly people walking or pushing carts. Carts of different sizes, maybe push carts that one person pushes, or some pulled by horses or mules, donkeys, whatever. But the streets are really crowded because Chicago has grown so fast. They didn't know what hit them when all these people began moving in. And this is a picture of a black family, an African American family that is moved in. Oops, sorry about that. Is moving in. And something I just want to point out to you is back then, people didn't have many opportunities to pose as a family for a photograph. So almost always when they did, they wore their very best clothes. So just to look, and you can tell this family is doing their best. Their clothes are clean. They're tidy. They may not look like today's clothes, but that's just the difference in styles from back then. Here's another picture of immigrants moving into Chicago. These people that we're looking at, they probably were processed in Ellis Island in New York, and then they had heard about jobs in Chicago, and they are boarding trains and getting to Chicago. At that time, look at this, 75% of all people in Chicago are new immigrants. Unbelievable. And then you can see it looks like a tiny room to me, place for, this is a one-room tenement. Most of them were one room. They may have little half walls somewhere to kind of separate some things. But all these people managed to try to roll out mattresses and sleep all in that one little room. You can tell by that picture there. So cities had to change quickly to accommodate so many more people. What are they going to do? And they had limited space. And they were already crowded. So again, I ask you, what could they do? Okay, so here's problem number one. Where would everyone work and live? This is a before picture before it was solved. And you will see that buildings, and there's very little space where there's not a building. And this is Chicago. You can see that the buildings are about 4 or 5 stories usually, sometimes 6, but that's about as high as buildings go. So I've kind of given you a hint on what the answer is. The solution, build taller buildings. And they couldn't do that until this time period because they didn't have steel. Steel is what allows them to build higher. Before that, if you're building out of stone, it starts getting so heavy you can't go beyond a certain height without it being so heavy it just all comes tumbling down. Steel, it may be heavy, but it is so strong it can support and continue to support more steel on top of it. So this is very important. Louis Sullivan invents the skyscraper. He designs and builds these skyscrapers using steel. So again, if they can't move out, what in the world do? They begin by building up, not sideways. So next problem. Here's problem number 2. How in the world would everyone get around? This is that same picture of crowded streets. What are you going to do? What if there's a fire? How do you even get down the street? Because as you may recall, in 1871, there was the Great Chicago Fire where half the city burned down. They couldn't even get down the streets. If this was to happen again, it would be another major catastrophe. So here's what they did. They came up with an idea. They came up with mass transit. That's the ability to move many people at the same time. So if you suddenly have things like this is a trolley. If you have trolleys, now these are people that are not having to walk everywhere or not having to pull carts. You have enough of them. You don't just put one on the street. You have them where they're coming by every couple minutes, And so suddenly the streets are becoming clear. So the trolley is an example of one type of mass transit. Here's another, the subways. So they figured out, hey, wait a second, we're moving up with our buildings. How about if we go below? Let's dig tunnels beneath the city, and we can have these underground railroads called subways. We have a lot of people riding on those things. If you've ever been on a subway, they usually come by every maybe 4 or 5 minutes. That's an average because sometimes it's a little longer. Sometimes it's a little quicker during rush hour. But they can move a lot of people. So they're getting people off the streets and getting the streets cleared. And here's a picture. Not every city has these, of course, but somebody pretty ingenious figured out, what if we put the train tracks, we elevate them above the streets so you can still have the streets being used, but now above are elevated trains. And you put little steps up and little train platforms where people can go up the steps to catch the train and come down the train when they get to their stop. And boy, ingenious, right? So those are some examples of public transportation. Now, the people who could afford maybe to move out, now we're not talking about the new immigrants that are recently in our country. The poorer people will not be able to move to suburbs. But the ones that are middle class who could afford to leave the downtown area, now that you have mass transit, now that you have trains that are taking people not just in the city, but to outside the city, outside the downtown area, now people can live further away. They can buy houses if they have the money. They can buy their own nice houses in the suburbs and then just walk down the street to a train station and ride the train into town or a subway into town. So these are perfect. So in today's definition, Sims is a suburb of Mobile. It doesn't look quite like this, but in certain places it does. It's got the houses that are fairly close by with sidewalks. Okay, and now here's the next thing. Okay, you've got all those people. They're working so many hours, so many days, but they do have a little free time. What are you going to do to keep people basically happy? Give them things to do. Because remember, recorded music hasn't been invented, so there's no radios. Recorded video has not been invented, so there's no TVs, no movies. There's no amusement parks, no sports stadiums. What are people going to do? You want to keep people relatively satisfied. So here's some of the answers. And we'll go through these pretty quickly because they're just examples, but they are examples that could be on the test. So pay attention. They came up with mass culture. That means things that many people can enjoy at the same time. Newspapers had not newspapers had been around for a long time, but they hadn't been able to be mass produced until the linotype machine. It reduced the time and cost of printing, and suddenly there was over 2,000 newspapers in the United States. Along with newspapers, we talked about Joseph Pulitzer already, right? He was in the vocabulary video. Well, he added color comics to his paper, and people loved it. They went wild for it. So soon other newspapers were adding color comics. And you may not think this is a big deal, but when you had nothing to do and suddenly you got color comics and they come out, these newspapers come out every day, that's a big deal. So people are getting news and entertainment at the same time. Another example is shopping. These giant retail shops called department stores began to appear in downtown areas of major cities. This is a mass culture example as well. So before this, if you wanted to go shopping for clothes for your family, something you'd have to go to maybe 3 or 4 stores just for the women's clothes, because undergarments, things like underwear, they wouldn't be in the same place as dresses, and they wouldn't be in the same store as shoes. And then for men, it's the same thing. You'd have to spend probably multiple days going from store to store. And now you've got these department stores that not only do they have seemingly everything you need, but they've got things like the fashions from Paris, the latest fashion. So it's things you can look at and dream about and be entertained by. Window shopping is what we, of course, call it now. They also created these magnificent parks. What you're looking at right here is probably the most famous park in all of America. I'm not talking about a national park, but I mean a park within a city. This is Central Park, and it's 843 acres right in the center of Manhattan. Manhattan is one of the 5 areas of New York City. It's the most famous area. You do need to know that it was designed and created by Frederick Olmsted. That will definitely be on the test because he is the creator. People since then, when they design parks, they look to him as being like the father of how to design city parks. And so this is a magnificent creation. And before this park was created, people had to, when they walked out of their tenement houses and they were poor, they never saw grass very much because when you walked out, you're on a crowded street, right? And you're surrounded by other buildings. You go around the corner, there's more buildings. You go down the street, there's more buildings and crowds. And this allows people to get away. And there are so many different types of activities in these great city parks, like Central Park. It has, by the way, it's either 37 or 38 playgrounds for kids. That many just for kids. There's so many things. There also the amusement park was invented. Coney Island, a very famous amusement park, was created in Brooklyn, right in New York City, right there on the ocean. And the first roller coaster. It changed its name to Cyclone, and that's what I've got a picture of. It was originally had a different name that I can't recall at the moment, but amusement park. So if you're counting with these mass culture, we're talking about newspapers with comics. We're talking about shopping department stores, talking about Central Park and other city parks, amusement parks. And in closing on this section, just want you to take a look at this. This is the entrance. Once you get past all the ticket booths, you're on Main Street in Disney World. And Disneyland's the same way. But take a look at the architecture. You may not be familiar with it, but I will just tell you, the hint is with the horse and the trolley in the right there. They have made the entrance to Disney World look like, because it's an amusement park, look like the way amusement parks, kind of a throwback to old times of the days when amusement parks were first created back in the Gilded Age, the Second Industrial Revolution. Okay, and that will end this fairly lengthy discussion that we've had here today. I hope you enjoyed it, take notes, and it prepares you for the test that you have coming up. When you see that you have a quiz on sections 20.1 and 20.2, it is indeed on what was included in this PowerPoint presentation from today. And that ends our recording session for now. Thank you.